Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to show you my process for painting these palm trees against a beautiful blue sky.
Here's my setup. I have a porcelain butcher's tray palette and a table desk that props my artwork up at about a 15-degree angle. I've taped around the edges of my Fabriano Artistico 140-pound cold-pressed cotton watercolor paper, and now I'm sketching on the palm trees. It's going to be important to have an accurate sketch to get started because we will be using masking fluid to protect these areas of the paper so that we can freely and easily do our blue washes over the top. I am just freehand sketching these palm trees. The beautiful thing about doing organic plant life is that it really doesn't matter if it looks exactly like the reference photo, as long as you get the essence of a palm tree with those beautiful curving, heavy looking branches and those spindly trunks. My masking fluid today is Daniel Smith masking fluid, and I'm going to be using a rubber tipped brush. These clean off perfectly and they're great for when you want to do masking fluid, but it doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly accurate or tiny little lines. I'm using that to glob the masking fluid in between the trunk. I want to protect some of these palm branches and the trunks for sure because they're going to be light colors, and if we were to accidentally cover those with blue, it would just mess up the colors of these areas completely. So we're filling that in and just generously applying the masking fluid all over the palm trees. I'm leaving a couple of the darker branches untouched with the masking fluid because in these areas it'll be okay if we cover those with the blue of the sky, since we'll be adding dark layers over the top of some of those branches anyway. I've left a link to my reference photo from Pixabay in the description below, by the way, so you guys can check that out if you'd like to try this project. My two colors on my palette right now are Daniel Smith Ultramarine Blue and Holbein Turquoise Blue. I'm mixing the two colors together to create a perfect combination of cool and warm blues, and I'm using my 1-inch Princeton Velvet Touch synthetic bristle brush. This will be great for applying these large flat washes. You can see the texture is a creamy consistency, and I tried to mix up enough paint so that I can cover the whole painting. I'm trying something a little new today. Usually I do flat washes wet and wet, but today I'm trying it wet and dry. And I wanted my color to be really dark, so I'm applying it in a thick wash starting from the top. And while it's still wet, you do have some leeway to push and pull that paint and smooth it out so it doesn't look quite so streaky. I do think I'm going to have to go over this again with more layers because with this initial wash, I definitely had quite a lot of streaks. I added more water as I worked my way towards the bottom, working side to side. I wanted it to be just a little bit lighter towards the bottom, so I had this very subtle gradient. I let that dry completely, and now I'm re-wetting the whole paper again, this time using a spray bottle to soak it. And you can use a brush too. I'm going to use my Winsor Newton Cotman mop brush to help spread out that water and smooth and soften the paint that's already on the surface. Sometimes when you're doing flat washes, you do have to do multiple layers just to get either the color correct or to work out any streaks that might be forming in the paper. I'm really glad that my paper is propped up at a slight angle because it's helping encourage the paint to drip downward. A little bit of scrubbing helps soften and smooth out some of those streaks, but remember, when you're working wet and wet, most of the time the water and paint will disperse evenly across the cotton paper. This is assuming you're using good quality paper. And then I take my 1-inch brush and I'm just adding another layer of blue across the top, removing some of the excess water as it's beginning to puddle and pool on the edges of my tape. This second wash looks a lot better, I think. I will probably end up adding one more, but for now this is a really good start. I cleaned the blue up off my palette. The wonderful thing about a porcelain palette is that it cleans up super easily. And now I'm going to take some paper towel, and I also have a sponge on hand, soak it in water and remove any excess. And I'm going to gently lift out some clouds on the right side of my composition over here. You can use just a gentle blotting motion. Make sure to switch around your paper towel so that you're always using the clean side to lift the paint back out. I'm going to do the same thing now with a sponge. Make sure that most of the water has been squeezed out, that it's just damp. And with this one, I can actually be a little more specific about where I'm removing the paint and removing and lifting a little more completely, so we're seeing more of that pure white paper showing through for this little clump of clouds. And I'm really enjoying how that's adding a nice touch to the composition. I've re-wet the paper one more time. I've upped the size of my brush here. This is actually the biggest brush I have. It's a 1.5-inch silver black velvet wash brush, and I'm using that to spread out the paint and water one more time, right over the top of those clouds even, and introducing a little bit more blue to the top of the composition. I think this final layer is going to do it, and I'm really happy with the color of my sky now. A larger brush will also help ensure that you're removing any excess water and paint, and it will look a little less streaky. Let your paper dry completely before removing your masking fluid. And definitely do not use the heat tool to speed up the process, or this will permanently fuse your masking fluid to the painting.
If you want to learn more about basic watercolor techniques like wet and wet, wet and dry, glazing, and many others, be sure to download my free watercolor jumpstart guide. It's a 20-page ebook filled with tips, tricks, and techniques for getting started with watercolor. I'll leave a link in the description so you guys can check that out.
All right, now it's time to do the trees. I'm squeezing out some Hansa Yellow Light and Burnt Sienna, both Daniel Smith colors, and using my Lebenzen small stiff white synthetic brush. It's a 1-inch bristle. I'm going to mix up some green for my trees using the blue that's on my palette, mixing that in with a Hansa Yellow Light. You can play with different mixes here. If you mix in a little bit of Burnt Sienna, it looks like more of an earthy green, and I think that'll be useful for some of the branches. And now is our chance to dive into realism a little bit more. We've been working with broad washes and very loose and expressive brush strokes, and now we get to tighten up everything with these details. I'm starting with this really light, almost spring green layer on the palm tree, leaving little strips of white showing the separation in the branches and any areas that are reflecting the sunlight. I'm also beginning to add some of the texture of those individual fronds. Now I'm mixing up some blue and a little bit of burnt sienna to create a really dark color. This is going to be very useful for the darker palm tree branches and shadow shapes. With that, I'm painting over the top of my first layer, leaving again some of the highlighted green underneath showing through. And this is useful for overlapping the background, creating more of that organic effect where the palm tree is really standing out against that dark blue sky. I did get quite realistic with this. I was observing my reference photo carefully, trying to capture all of the light and shadow shapes that I saw in my reference image. There are some really strong shadows, particularly on the left side of the trees. It's a good idea to locate the light source in your reference photo, but using just these primaries, burnt sienna is serving as my red, I can create a beautiful variety of colors for my tree. Using a long sweeping motion, I use my darkest combination of the 3 primaries to paint a shadow, and then tiny little horizontal brush strokes all the way up the tree to create the texture of the trunk. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna and yellow, quite watered down, and this is the tone I'm using to paint the tree. You can see why it was so necessary to protect these areas with the masking fluid. If the blue had covered these up, it would be a completely different color and it would look all wrong. So we're going to use that same color for the other tree. This one is a little shorter. I really love the character of these 2 little palm trees standing side by side, one tall and one short. I think they're so cute.
If you're finding this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps me out as a creator to be able to continue bringing you free content like this.
Continuing on with the shorter palm tree, I'm using that same spring green color for the first layer, and you can allow that color to overlap the background in areas where the palms are a little bit darker. Sometimes we might need to fight the urge to try to just stay within the lines, but in the case of masking fluid, it's rarely going to be left the way it is when you remove it. You're going to need to do some adjusting with your paint afterwards, and of course multiple layers over the top. So now with my dark color, again this is a combination of burnt sienna and blue mostly, and a tiny bit of yellow. I'm painting the shadow tones inside of the branches using small individual parallel brush strokes, moving in the direction of those palm leaves. They're so beautiful and droopy. Be sure to leave little highlights, little gaps in between your brush strokes so you have a variety of values ranging from light to dark and everything in between. I am trying to leave little strips of white in the center of each of those palm leaves so that we can easily see the structure of the leaf. It's almost like the skeleton or the backbone of each one, holding it tight. And then I'm using almost a hair-like texture for some of these leaves overlapping the background. Do make sure that both of your trees have their own unique quality and character. They need to look different from each other. So even if you're not using a reference photo to follow along, you can still make them look like palm trees, just make them unique. Once you're all finished and everything is completely dry, you can remove your masking tape and check out your final painting.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Check out these other landscape tutorials using watercolor, and I'll see you there.